Good morning, guys. A little early Thursday morning coffee talk for you as we start winding down the week a little bit. Some really important stories to get to today, and I'm going to try to get through three things that I think you should know as we look at some really big stories that could have wide sweeping impact. And what's interesting, last night, got very little sleep. Baby was moving a lot, and we had a kind of a crazy weather pattern here that kind of blew through the Austin area. Weather is a great analogy that we're going to use both as a news story. It's a solid news story, but also a kind of as I said, an analogy to use for some other stories that we're going to be looking at today. Of course, one of the big stories to watch in the country is that there is a forecast for a potential hurricane to make landfall on Saturday in the Louisiana, Texas area. One of my good weather forecaster friends used to tell me anything 5 days out is just a guessing game. But when you get to about 3 days, you can the forecast starts sort of coming together in a more solid way. And we're already seeing flooding in New Orleans because of the weather pattern that has already arrived and brought this rainfall. Really important to think about as we go back to a couple stories that we've covered over the last few months. Remember, we've had massive flooding in areas along the Mississippi River, along the Arkansas River. There's been a lot of flooding all over the country over the last several months. So if there's one thing a lot of states don't need, it's more rain. And so that it's important to watch this weather pattern, not only if it becomes a hurricane, which it is expected to do, but you never know. If it brings a lot of rain, it can be just as destructive. And New Orleans is already dealing with some pretty bad flooding already. So really something to watch. As a metaphor, if you will, we can kind of apply the metaphor of weather or a brewing disruption on the horizon when it comes to the economy. I was watching what the Federal Reserve Chairman said yesterday. He was kind of on fire giving a press conference. Now, the Federal Reserve is important because it sets the federal funds rate. This is the rate that banks lend to each other. It also helps determine all of our loan rates. Your home equity line of credit, your credit card, your auto loan are set by how high some of these this major rate is. And so every few months, the Fed can determine, do they raise rates or do they lower rates? And what the Federal Reserve Chairman said is that he's concerned still about the economy, what's going on globally as a global kind of slowdown hits. There's been a lot of talk about that, and there's been some concern about it. So he's concerned about that. He's also concerned about trade policy, and for those reasons, he sort of indicated that he might be open to dropping rates, which would mean that it would be more cheap for you to get a loan, and it would keep your loan rates lower. So that wouldn't happen immediately, but it could be something that happens in the future. In some cases, that's, people get excited about that because that means consumers can access money, which means that the economy keeps going. And that's a good way to kind of keep the economy going during a time that you want to see, the economy do well. Others can take that as not a great sign, because if you're lowering interest rates because you're concerned about an economic slowdown, then the reason why you're doing it causes concern for some investors. So I just want you to know that question about a global economic slowdown on the horizon, forecasters are really looking far into the horizon. It could develop into something dramatic or it could not. And so just keep that in mind. I feel like since the beginning of the year, mid last year, everyone's been talking about this global economic slowdown. And the stats to back it up here in the United States, it shows some slowing, but again, it's one of those things where what will it develop into? Is it an economic hurricane, or is it a bad rainstorm, or is it nothing? That's far out. So you should know it's still yet to be determined. Final thing I think you should know today is we got the numbers yesterday for June when it comes to southern border apprehensions. This is really an important number from Customs and Border Protection, because in May we had such a high number. It was a 13-year high of border apprehensions. And so the big question for June is, are we going to see the same thing? And, weather could actually be a factor here. And here's why. We did see numbers come down in June. So in May, we were at 140,000 of apprehensions, about just over 133. I'll get very precise. It was about 100. Let me read it to you. It was in May, 144,000 of apprehensions and inadmissibles. So these are folks that either illegally crossed the U.S. southern border or were turned away at the U.S. southern border. That included 133,000 apprehended. And that's when we can look at the groups, were they women and children, were they single adults, were they unaccompanied minors, what did they look like? That's what we had in May. So a really big number. In June, the total number was 104,000. And when it comes to those that were actually apprehended, so taken into custody in some manner, you were looking at almost 95,000 individuals. So on the one hand, you think, hey, that's much better than May. It's almost 40,000 less people in May, and it's better to see that number decrease than rise. But remember, these are only the folks that we've apprehended. This is not the total number who have come illegally across the U.S. border. We don't have that number. I think important context is this. If I looked over the last, 4 or 5 years, going back to 2014, every June we have seen numbers decrease from May. One of the reasons could be it gets pretty hot in June. And making this treacherous journey is always dangerous, but especially in the heat. And you start seeing the numbers come down just as a trend overall. Again, I'm generalizing, I'm going back to 2014, I'm seeing it drop through June and July. And then it kind of picks back up in the fall. Tends to be a trend. So on the one hand, it's good the numbers decrease. On the other hand, this kind of happens at this time of the year. The question is, why did we see the decrease? I reached out to Customs and Border Protection to ask that. One of the reasons why I wanted to get more specific on it is, of course, during the last several weeks, the Trump administration talked about Mexico becoming a better partner at the border. I'm wondering, was that the effect? Was that part of the reason? Were there less large groups coming across the border? What was the reason? Other big takeaway you should know is that family units, remember, are the predominant bulk of groups coming across the southern border. In fact, I was just thinking about this now. Listen to this. The family units that crossed in June were around 57,000 family units. So an adult traveling with a child, okay? That is more than the total that were apprehended last year at the same time. So this June, we have 57,000 family units that were apprehended. Last June, in total, 43,000 people were apprehended. So it's still a massive problem. I mean, obviously it wouldn't go away like that, but the numbers are showing that it continues to be a big deal. It is not like any other time in history. We are continuing to see the bulk of those apprehended being family units. And that is something that we have never seen before in this way, ever. So just remember that. I heard one politician being interviewed this weekend and said, well, we've been here before. We did this during the Bush administration. We've seen these numbers. If you just look at the numbers, yeah, we've seen these numbers before. We've seen 1 million people apprehended at the U.S. southern border before. We have not seen these numbers when it comes to family units or minors traveling by themselves. We have never, according to the data, seen that before. So just remember that. Okay, guys, let me know if you'd like us to check anything else out today. Of course, always looking for your thoughts on stories. info@smarternews.com. Direct message us as well on social media. We have some exciting interviews being recorded tomorrow. So I'm really stoked about that. Can't wait to share that with you, and always looking forward to your thoughts. So have a great day, and I'll see you later.